The Seth Leibsohn Show, where it's principles, not politics. Now, guest hosting for Seth, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser.
Good evening. This is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser in the chair for Seth Leibsohn this week, and I can't tell you how fast this week went. It's just been a blast to fill in for Seth. Humbled by the ability to be able to sit in his chair, and I hope he had a great time away and able to recharge, and all of you will be blessed to have your own host back next week, and the occupation of his chair will end as of this evening. So thank you, Seth, for giving me the opportunity to sit in your chair. And no, it was not an occupation. It was a friendly exchange, and the ability to give me the opportunity to continue to promote the speaking of truth from an American Muslim who cares about my country, the security of it, and as what Seth and so many have said, is the greatest conflict of our time, which is the battle against radical and political Islam. And we've also been able to share with each other some of the issues of the day in the past few days, from CPAC all the way through to the historic speech from Prime Minister Netanyahu on Tuesday. So today, the news is quite significant as far as sort of the fallout from the speech and what the reality is of the talks with Iran. I do want to talk just for a second. Last night, yesterday evening, we had a wonderful session at the Walter Cronkite School for Journalism at ASU, sponsored by AZ Central, Arizona Republic, and the Walter Cronkite School on the situation in Syria. And I was joined by a number of Syrian activists, including ASU student Zaina and Dr. Suhair Bitar and Kayla Mueller's pastor. We were moderated by E.J. Montini and had some time speaking about sort of laying out for an audience of, I think there were over 200 people there, and the video should be available, so I'd ask you all to look at it. I think it was many people who were there told us that it was very educational, and they had a whole new understanding of exactly what brought us to the chaos that is now Syria, that there was no life. People say that if only the bombing would stop, if only the killing would end, and many came up to me afterwards and said, they really understood when I mentioned that even though it's horrific, the displacement of 5 million, the deaths of hundreds of thousands, that now the world knows there is life in Syria, and there was no life for over 50 years since the fascist, socialist, nationalist of the Ba'ath Party took over in 1963. So people are beginning to understand exactly how humanitarian heroes like Kayla Mueller, who gave their life, how there are tens of thousands, if not millions, of Kayla Muellers in Syria, and we spent some time talking about that. So check out that video at azcentral.com on the situation in Syria. It was a great panel. And the other thing somebody told me and tweeted out was that we speak truth to power. And I think this is the reality. I got a nice email from a follower yesterday from the show who said that, the ability to speak truth to power is the difference between those who make a difference and are in the arena and those who do not. And I do think that is obviously what I dedicate my life to, and Seth does, and so many people do. And that's why this is principles, not politics, because people who speak the truth care about principles and ideas. People who want to be in power only for the power don't care about the truth. So ultimately, I think, Gandhi said it best in which he said, truth never damages a cause that is just. And I do believe there are many just causes that we're letting fall to the wayside. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, DRZUHDI Jasser, Twitter handle, or AIF Democracy. My Facebook is MZ Jasser. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn this week. And as far as the news goes, it was also amazing to see continued reports that Iraqi forces are pushing toward Tikrit as they seek to dislodge ISIS. And CNN was reporting that. And what is amazing to me is that it is the Republican Guard, the semi-official Iranian news service basically said that Qasem Soleimani, who is the commander of the elite Al-Quds Brigade, is helping oversee the operation. This is one of the leaders of the intelligence services of Iran, who basically is taking credit for being in Iraq, in Tikrit, and pushing back ISIS. So for anyone who doubts that Iraq has now become a client state of Iran, when you have the head of an intelligence service who had not been seen publicly for some time make his first public appearance in Tikrit to make the statement that they push back ISIS, this is not only a military victory for Iran, but a political victory, and they're making it a point to have their intelligence chief show his face in Tikrit. And, there's a concept I think everybody should understand, and I hope this week I've been able to share with you some of the concepts that I've learned to accept and believe as a Muslim, but also fight as an American, that I think are problems that need reform. And one of those is this concept of the old concept of the division of the land of Islam versus the land of war. And this was at the time in the 7th and 8th century as the Muslim community or state was being confronted by those that fought it, that were non-Muslim. It divided the world into Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, so there was no in-between. These medieval or 7th century concepts have been reawakened and used by supremacists to say that that's the way the world should be today. Forget the fact that secular democracies have emerged in the 17th, 18th century with America and Europe in the 18th century and on. And ultimately these revolutions gave rise to the end of the need for a religious state and the dominance of a free democratic state that separates church and state. So ultimately, Dar al-Islam is the concept, the land of Islam, and everything else must be war. And this is the imperialist desires of the Islamic State. So when you read the news stories today and you see Iran pounding its chest that it has helped push back ISIS, it is imperializing Iraq as it has done Syria, as it did Lebanon, and as it is doing in Yemen with the Houthi Shiites that ousted the king of Yemen. And while some of this may be intramural battles within Islam, both, whether they be Sunni Islamists or Shia Islamists, want to dominate and be the center, as the Prime Minister said a few days ago, in this Game of Thrones. And this Game of Thrones may shift around, but the bottom line, they're either supremacists, whether they be Sunni or Shia, and they are a threat to the West. And we need to understand that that threat to the West is not only existential, but it is real. They do want to destroy the West. When Hassan Nasrallah uses language in which he says he hopes Jews go to Israel so that they can be collected in one place so that they may be attacked and killed, God forbid. This is the language they use, and what the Prime Minister was trying to remind America in his speech, that their anti-Semitism is not just bluster, it is real, and this is why they cannot get the bomb. And, this is ideology that we need to understand, because we can't formulate a strategy and a policy unless we truly understand it. And this comes back to bite us. Yesterday after our panel, I went home and followed some of the Twitter feed, and woke up early this morning only to find another attack against my work. And Tariq Fatah, one of the liberal allies of ours, who is a boots on the ground, if you will, Muslim reformer that's working to counter political Islam along with us. He's based out of Toronto, has his own radio program there, and I'd ask you to look him up, Tariq Fatah, F-A-T-A-H. He posted a attack against both he and myself that appeared in the Ummah.com, UMMAH.com. Ummah in Arabic means the Muslim community or the Muslim state. And this Abdul Rahman posted on Ummah.com, which is a very frequently traveled Islamist jihadist type website that claims to be nonviolent but yet is pretty militant. It said, "I've come to realize that the munafiqeen in Arabic are hypocrites. In the Quran are those Muslims that pretended to be Muslim were actually spies and surgeons for the infidels. The munafiqeen like Tariq Fatah and Zudi Jasser and the Killiam Foundation, which is another reform organization that we work with out of London. Killiam is run by Majid Nawaz, who many of you may have seen on CNN and Fox and He's been on a number of programs recently that both he and I have traveled in. And so this poster says, they are 100,000 times more dangerous to this ummah, Muslim community or Muslim state, than any kuffar, which would be an infidel. They are the hijab is cultural crowd, the gays have rights crowd, the ar-rajam al-hadith are fake, which is about the throwing of the stones in the hadith against the Jews, that we say that that's fake, which is exactly what I believe. May Allah protect us from such horrendous kufr and deviance and increase us in fear of them. And then ultimately he states, may Allah allow us to cleanse this ummah of this filthy, secularist, liberal Islam hypocrites. So that is a call of apostasy, and which would be a punishment by death. And clearly we take these things seriously, forward them to authorities, but the bottom line is that this is what happens to Muslims on the front line. We are apostated by these Islamists who will do anything possible. And, I think the reason I bring this to your attention is that they're saying here, we are 100,000 times more dangerous to the ummah than any kuffar, because they realize that we will completely diffuse any ability for them to spread their supremacism, because we diffuse the supremacism and promote liberty and freedom, and thus end the Islamic State and their ability to maintain power, which I think is central to this. So, the book that meant a lot to me is by Eric Hoffer. I know he's a liberal. He was a late 50s activist whose ideas became part of the civil rights movement, but he wrote a book called The True Believer. And when we come back, I want to read you an excerpt from it that really I think is so key to talking about which movements are successful, be they conservative or liberal. And it's just, I think, important to know that true belief and speaking truth to power is the central aspect of success. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth. We'll be right back.
Every highway, you've seen better days. The morning
This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, President of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Just honored to be sitting in Seth's chair. And the last day I'll be with you, as it'll be great to have Seth back in his own chair, talking to all of you, as I'm sure you miss him from being away this week, and hopefully he had a good time. Continuing our thought, the issue is what is a true believer? And I think it is, and by the way, before I get to that, soon we're going to be joined by Claire Lopez from the Center for Security Policy, and I'm going to talk to her about how do we ferret out the Islamist threat, security clearances with those who may be within government. I think this is so key, and as a Muslim, I want nothing more than American Muslims to contribute to our national security and be at the head of that spear. But I also want to make sure we don't do what we did in the Cold War, which was empower many enemies within, which can happen with Islamists that may be within the government. And then later we'll welcome Raquel Saraswati, a reform-minded American Muslim woman who has been with us on the front lines in protecting women's rights, speaking and advocating for education on the understanding of how prevalent female genital mutilation is, child marriage, the abuse of women, honor killings and honor abuse. And we'll spend some time. I'd like to introduce all of you to Raquel, and we'll do that in the second hour. Right now, I'd like to go back to talking about just reading from The True Believer, because there are a few passages there that I think are important. And Eric Hoffer, and again, this is a liberal activist, and as a conservative, we can learn. My mom taught me you can always learn something from everybody, and I think there's a lot. For example, the conservatives could have learned from the success of President Obama and his campaign in 2007 and 2008 that ultimately brought him into the presidency. Eric Hoffer says, his book deals with some peculiarities common to all mass movements, be they religious, social, or nationalist movements. It does not maintain that all movements are identical, but that they share certain essential characteristics which give them a family likeness. All mass movements generate in their adherents a readiness to die and a proclivity for united action. All of them, irrespective of the doctrine they preach and the program they project, breed fanaticism, enthusiasm, fervent hope, hatred, and intolerance. All of them are capable of releasing a powerful flow of activity in certain departments of life. All of them demand blind faith and single-hearted allegiance. All movements, however different in doctrine and aspiration, draw their early adherents from the same types of humanity. They all appeal to the same types of mind. And again, I'm putting this in the context of where are all the moderate voices, reform-minded Muslims. The Islamists are pulling in from this group that want to die, and they're pulling. This is how ISIS grows so quickly. But then how do we counter that? And Hoffer continues, though there are obvious differences between the fanatical Christian, the fanatical Mohammedan, the fanatical nationalist, the fanatical communist, and the fanatical Nazi, it is yet true that fanaticism, which animates them, may be viewed and treated as one. The same is true of the force which drives them on to expansion and world dominion. There is a certain uniformity in all types of dedication of faith, of pursuit of power, of unity, and of self-sacrifice. There are vast differences in the contents of holy causes and doctrines, but a certain uniformity in the factors which make them effective. He who, like Pascal, finds precise reasons for the effectiveness of Christian doctrine has also found the reasons for the effectiveness of communist, Nazi, and nationalist doctrine. However different the holy causes people die for, they perhaps die for the same thing. So ultimately, the key is what we will die for, and I think this is how it's going to take some time to build Muslim movements for liberty and against Islamism, because it will not be potent unless we find Muslims that want to do this, aren't afraid, as you saw in this attack that I posted on my Facebook page this morning. Basically, it's calling me an apostate, calling Tariq Fatah an apostate, calling Majid Nawaz, one of the leading reformers out of London, an apostate, and quoting from the Quran and saying that we are basically munafiqeen, which are hypocrites that pretend to be Muslim, that were convicted with penalty of death at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. So, while obviously the context is very different, and we as Muslims love our faith, we believe in the example of the Prophet, but also believe that times have changed and that there are things that should be relegated to history. And there are passages that need reform, and I think this is why the true believer is something that we should learn from. So we'll put that bookmark there and come back to it later. Before we get to our guest, I wanted to also look at, it's important to note that Secretary Kerry has now decided to go and try to do what I would call the Genuflect Tour 6.0, where he has gone back to Saudi Arabia to try to make sure that they know that we are still on their side and they are our frenemy, if you will, which a term which I really hate because it makes it seem like there is some friendship there. Yes, we share common enemies, but, the fact that we ignore how their ideologies are boot camps for ISIS is just, it's as for Muslims especially, it's just horrific to us. But anyway, the bottom line is, as Prime Minister Netanyahu mentioned, a nuclear arms race, let alone any types of arms race, would be horrific for the Middle East. And our Secretary of State went to meet in Riyadh with the foreign ministers of the GCC, which is the Gulf Cooperation Council, and he met with them, be they from Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and all of them were much stronger on the need to push back and make sure that Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons. And Secretary Kerry went there to reassure them. Now, what was said and what came of that, I don't know. I hope his reassurances are better than the reassurances we're being given about this plan that we still don't know the details of. But I think Prime Minister Netanyahu laid out the folly in the sunset clause and so many aspects of this plan that many of us should rightly be concerned about. But, as I called it a genuflect tour to the Gulf again because, Raif Badawi was now being considered for being put back on death row because of quote-unquote apostasy. While yesterday 67 members of Congress sent a letter to the president and to Saudi Arabia telling them to demand that he be released. And it's amazing to me, yet Saudi columnists were writing congratulating Congress on their stance in listening to Prime Minister Netanyahu and hold strong hawkishly against any attempt for Iran to have the nuclear weapon, any nuclear weapon programs. And yet, while they congratulate Congress, they ignore a letter that they sent yesterday as if Raif Badawi doesn't exist. And he has not only been whipped and flogged a couple times and now hasn't gone back because he was too ill from the flogging. There are not only behind every Raif Badawi, there are hundreds and thousands like him in the prisons of Saudi Arabia. When we come back, we're going to talk to Claire Lopez from the Center for Security Policy about security clearances, the Islamist threat in America, and what we can do, first, to understand that threat, and second, to begin to build better filters so that we don't have spies and others working to reveal our secrets to our greatest enemies. And we have to understand who those enemies are. This is Zuhdi Jasser from the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, sitting in for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show. Principles, not politics. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn. This will be the last day you'll have to tolerate me, and it's been an honor to sit in Seth's chair. He'll be back with you next week. And on the Seth Leibsohn Show, Principles, Not Politics. And I am just honored now to be joined by Claire Lopez. And before I introduce her, I just wanted to finish one thought before the last segment. We had talked about, it's amazing. Yes, you can do the realpolitik, as Secretary Kerry's trying to do as he does his genuflection tour through the Gulf right now. And, okay, fine, we need to make sure our allies are with us with common enemies. But it is horrifying to me that he wasn't able to still mention Raif Badawi and mention the prisoners of conscience, as Nathan Sharansky wrote about in the Washington Post. And I think our soul as a country is compromised. Our values are compromised when our secretaries and our president ignore the crimes against humanity done by countries like Saudi Arabia, and it makes them really disrespect us. And, I appreciate the 67 congressmen and women, bipartisan, that sent the letter about Raif yesterday. Now let's get to know Claire Lopez. I think you've been on the program before, right, Claire?
I may have been, but I'm certainly glad to be with you today.
Thank you. Claire is the Vice President for Research and Analysis at the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C., a think tank, one of the leading think tanks in America focused on national security issues. And certainly I've known the Center for Security Policy for some time in our work. So, Claire, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Zuhdi.
Hey, and I had to have you on as I saw this comprehensive dossier that your center put out on Congressman Andre Carson from Indiana. And it talks about his ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. And what I want the audience to understand, our listeners to understand, is, and you lay out in this comprehensive dossier, and I'd ask all of you to go to the Center for Security Policy's website and download the PDF and just read it. These are not only links to various what I call Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups in America, and Claire will talk about those briefly. But the issue here is Congressman Andre Carson is now on the House Intel Committee, and the Intelligence Committee has privy to our country's most vital secrets. So, I think this is, once you all understand the importance of what happens when a congressman has access to this who also has an ideological problem, I want to contextualize that with something that may, what did we do during the Cold War when we had similar issues on Intel committees, and is there an analogy there? So can you lay out for us a little bit about the dossier and what you all laid out in the dossier on Congressman Andre Carson?
Sure, Zuhdi. That was a great introduction of the topic. And as you and perhaps your listeners may know, I spent the first part of my professional career with the CIA, where I had a focus on the Soviet Union and Russia. And these were partly years of the Cold War and partly years after the Cold War ended. But what I can say is that during that time, we were very much focused on counterintelligence awareness. Not that we always got it right. We didn't. And certainly if you go back further in our American history in the 30s and the 40s and beyond, the communist infiltration of our system at all levels, but certainly top levels of national security, as Diana West has laid out so wonderfully in her book, American Betrayal, is testament to how badly things can go wrong. But the concern that we have currently, I think, is analogous to that, and we should refer back to that era as you did, just as we were concerned with communist infiltration of our government in those years. We need to be aware aware that the Muslim Brotherhood and its front groups, or legacy groups as you call them, are very much involved in an intelligence war against us, information warfare. And so when someone with such close ties to the Brotherhood and its many different groups, like Andre Carson, is appointed to the United States House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, or HPSI as we call it sometimes, it's got to be a matter of deep concern.
Can you talk about now some of the groups you laid out, and I think most of the audience from either listening to me or Seth or others knows the problems with, for example, the Council on American Islamic Relations. Yesterday, Maricopa County Attorney Bill Montgomery and I spoke about their lawfare and others. But you also note the Muslim American Society, the Islamic Circle of North America. I mean, the Chicago Tribune had an expose in 2004 that called them basically the infrastructure, the MAS. The Muslim American Society is the Muslim Brotherhood in America. And can you lay out for us what the MAS and ICNA, how we should look at those organizations?
Well, exactly in the same way as we do an organization like CARE or like ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America. And the reason is that we have the Muslim Brotherhood's own documents that actually list these organizations. For instance, at the final page of the explanatory memorandum on the strategic goals of the group, that is the Brotherhood for North America, written in 1991 by the senior Brotherhood leader in America at that time, Muhammad Akram, and meant as a report about things in America back to the mothership, as it were, of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And the last page of that document lists what are called, in the document, our friends and the organizations of our friends. And these groups are all on that list. So it's not, any one of us that is simply saying this or accusing them of having these ties, but the Brotherhood's own document said that. And this document, of course, was submitted in evidence at the 2008 Holy Land Foundation Hamas terror funding trial in Texas. So it's also accepted into evidence by the Department of Justice, which prosecuted that case.
And I think, and people can go to the net and look at not only your work at CSP, but the Investigative Project and others that have quoted many speeches, be it Muslim Student Association speeches where they are advocating for an allegiance to jihad, the Muslim American Society having a bayat or an allegiance that students takes, on and on. But the thing I think that's important for Andre Carson's issue is I don't think that, and at least I'm not saying that necessarily, he's going to reveal secrets to our enemies. He takes an oath, I'll take him by his word. The issue, though, when we come back, I want to talk about the lens that an Islamist would use in looking at all the information and how that hampers our strategy and makes our strategy completely impotent, if not harmful, because that's my concern. And I think, the leaks and things like that he can be prosecuted, and there are protections against that, and nobody's trying to make this into a McCarthyistic type thing. But the lens he uses, if it's Islamist and sympathetic with our enemies, will do just as much harm. And we come back, we'll talk about that. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in with Seth and joined by Claire Lopez from the Center for Security Policy. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show. I am proud to be joined by Claire Lopez, the Vice President of Research and Analysis at the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C., a preeminent think tank focused on national security issues. And I want to cut right back to it because there's so much to talk about here. There is a clinic, I think, here in a teaching moment for Americans to understand. Yes, there is a duly elected congressman. Nobody's saying that he doesn't have a right to be in any committees. His name is Congressman Andrew Carson. He's from Indiana. The question is, and I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple years ago called Our Military's Ground Zero in the Battle Against Islamism. And I was talking about threats within our military like Nasser Abdo, like Nidal Hassan and others who had questionable allegiances, were given sort of the the free pass of their religion, as Nasser Abdo was given conscientious objection status by the Assistant Secretary of the Army, only to later become arrested and then convicted as a terrorist. So these things are problematic because of the Islamist ideology. Now, that doesn't mean that every Muslim who's an Islamist is also a terrorist, but Andre Carson has a track record that the CSP's dossier lays out is associated with a lot of these American Islamist groups who also have association with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So can you lay out for us, Claire, the harm? Because I don't think he's going to be releasing secrets. He abides by his oath to Congress, to this country. He will maintain the secrecy. But the lens that he uses to review material that should be based upon the battle of liberty against Islamism and its threat, is that the lens he uses, or will there be another one, and how does that harm our security?
Right. Well, I think there are two things to look at here, and I absolutely agree with you that the principal concern that I and we at the center have is not that Representative Carson would be passing secrets, illicitly classified material to Brotherhood organizations. But one aspect that I want to highlight, and then I'll get to the OIC, is that the groups themselves, the groups like CARE and ISNA and ICNA and so forth, with which he associates on such a frequent basis, may view him as a conduit for information operations and the use of the representative, whether he's witting of it or not, as a vehicle for exerting influence from the Brotherhood into the top ranks of U.S. national security by way of the HIPC, the House Intelligence Committee. Now, the other thing that you just brought up, I think, is equally valid, Judy, and that is that given the representative's worldview, which is so closely aligned, apparently, by his association with these groups, and we know that these groups are jihadist organizations. Because they are affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, they align with a jihadist worldview. And so the question has to be, how does his view align? How does his view comport with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, that is the 57-member head of state, king level of all Muslim countries in the world, 56 of them plus the
and I call
Palestinians makes 57.
Yeah, I call that the neo caliphate of today.
Could be very well the kernel of the neo caliphate, Islamic State aside, but you know their worldview is very much a jihadist worldview as well. And we look at something like their 10-year plan, which is reaching culmination this year, 2015, in which their number one objective is to impose limits on the freedom of speech and to counter any criticism of Islam or Allah or Muhammad, and to influence countries around the world to implement laws actually to curb free speech criticism of this kind of the ideology of jihad or the ideology of Sharia that commands jihad. And you have to ask how closely is Representative Carson's worldview aligned with that?
And I think,
and so it's a serious concern.
Exactly, and I think if you look back at the Cold War, ultimately Natan Sharansky laid out that he felt he'd be free when he heard President Reagan call them the evil empire. And when I spoke at CPAC, I said, I hope the conservative movement begins to believe and understand that the OIC is today's evil empire. So as I see it from that lens, as a reformist, if you have a congressman on the Intel Committee who sees jihad as a benevolent thing, who sees, the Islamic State as not Islamic, so let's not use the term Islam, and does apologetics, which basically empowers the OIC movement to represent Islam and not say that we need to reform, that ends up being somebody who doesn't call a spade, obstructs reformers, and thus lifts up intel information that would actually advocate nonviolent Islamism, which I believe is almost more dangerous than the violent Islamism that really anyone can pick out as a threat to our security.
Well, indeed, I think that in this country, at least, never mind abroad, but in this country, the major threat from the Muslim Brotherhood, indeed, is not violence. It's not violent terrorism, but rather the information operations it's truly intelligence operations of subordination of national worldview policy, foreign policy as well as domestic policy, about how the United States will treat the ideology of jihad, which is coming against us in
so tell me,
ways. And
we're running on time short here. I want to ask you one quick thing. So what should the chairman of this subcommittee have said publicly if he was going to deny Congressman Carson's position, and how could we have confronted that?
Well, the problem, you see, of course, is the rules in the House. And while the Republicans control the House now and can name the chairman and most of the members, the majority of the members on these committees, like the Intelligence Committee, it's entirely the prerogative of the minority party, now the Democrats, and their leader, which is Nancy Pelosi, to name their members to the Intelligence Committee, and that is entirely within her purview to do that.
But let's say Pelosi was a Senator Lieberman and who got it. What would a Senator Lieberman have said when Andre Carson had a little temper tantrum because he wasn't allowed on the Intel Committee?
Well, I mean, I think you have to certainly be cognizant of the concerns, the very real and genuine intelligence and national security concerns of having somebody like a Representative Carson on the committee. I don't know exactly how they're going to deal with this, how the committee chairman, who is now Representative Devin Nunes, is going to handle this, or how he, within the rules of the House, how he can handle it. But I think we all need to be cognizant of the threat to national security posed by someone with Representative Carson's associations being on the committee, having access to that material, intelligence, classified material, as well as the ongoing, deep, continuing close ties to Muslim Brotherhood organizations. That's got to be something that we need to deal with.
Well, God bless you for your work. This is just so essential, and I put myself again at your service. If you all anytime need to, I think we should have a national conversation about how to vet these types of issues, be they in the military, be they in our government, elected committees and others, appointed committees, because this is key. Who are the Islamists and who are our allies? This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth. Thank you, Claire Lopez.
Like the sun falling out of the clear blue sky, there goes my baby.
This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show. Finishing up our first hour here, and so much to learn about the threat and what we can do to keep our country safe. Again, nobody's saying that Congress people like Andre Carson shouldn't continue to have a voice or trying to make their voice illegal. No, this is about free speech. But also when you're talking about access to intel, access to information that is supposed to be protecting our freedoms and liberty, the U.S. Constitution, and countering Islamists, which are our greatest threat, the ideology. When we were fighting the Soviets, nobody said we should work closely with the communist movements of Central America or non-Soviet communists that didn't buy into the imperialism of the Soviet Union. So, Islamists who apologize for the Islamic State, but yet maybe nonviolent, maybe against the militancy of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt or the Islamists of the OIC, that doesn't make them our allies. And certainly, I think it compromises us when our leadership that tells us about the intelligence that they can't report to us, but yet act based on that. I worry that their actions will be based on Islamist lens rather than one based on freedom. I'm actually looking forward in a few days to be in Ottawa, sort of the Canadian CPAC, if you will, which is called the Manning Center's Networking Conference, or MNC 2015, is going to take place in Ottawa. The Toronto Sun, which I tweeted out earlier today, has a article that talks about this annual conference of conservatives that happens in Ottawa. And, I have to tell you, they said the must-watch session will be Threats to Democracy, China, and Islamic Extremism, featuring Hong Kong activist Martin Lee and myself of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, Zuhdi Jasser. So I'm looking forward to joining our Canadian brothers and sisters and their conservative conference at the Manning Networking Conference this weekend in Ottawa, and hopefully we'll have a video for all of you here to take a look at. One quick item that was in the Jerusalem Post that I just had to mention. Iranians are again, the Iranian government, the Khomeinists, they say that Prime Minister Netanyahu's historic description and bluster was erroneous about the Jewish people, that in fact Iran is a historic haven for the Jewish people. And Zarif said that Netanyahu's position reflected bigotry over facts and asserted that the Iranian government and people had saved the Jews 3 times in history. Once during that time of a prime minister when trying to kill the Jews, the king saved the Jews. And again during the time of Cyrus, where he saved the Jews from Babylon, and again during the Second World War. And then he alluded to the Holocaust and said the morning after Netanyahu's speech, conservative newspapers in Iran ran cartoons denying Hitler's genocide against the Jews actually ever happened. So this is the bizarre nature of fascist press. And, you can never cease to be amazed at if it wasn't so serious as anti-Semitism and the Holocaust that these militant fascists lie about, it would be funny, but it's not. When we come back, we're going to be joined by Raquel Saraswati, a reform-minded Muslim feminist, activist who's on the front lines with us at the American Islamic Forum that I'd like to introduce you all to. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn on The Seth Leibsohn Show. The last hour this week, sitting in for Seth in his chair. It's been a privilege to sit for him, and I'm sure you're all anxious to have him back next week. And what I wanted to do is, ISIS remains in the news with various stories that we continue to hear frequently about. We began the week with Saturday Night Live having that sort of bizarre commercial mocking it, which offended some of us, and others thought it brought light to it. And today, Jerusalem Post has a little story about an Egyptian man doing this bizarre surprise to his bride. 25-year-old Ahmed Shahada surprised his bride-to-be and the guests at his wedding by staging a kidnapping of hooded ISIS militants, holding swords and mimicking the scenes in horrifying videos. The bride actually thought there were going to be some terrorism or even decapitation of their victims, and then they unmasked themselves and thought it was funny. There's a reality behind what's happening with ISIS that, sometimes comedy might seem to make things a little easier to deal with. But the reality is today the Homeland Security has released another stark warning that American youth need to be observed, especially Muslim youth, about radicalization. And they actually particularly called out the threat of young American Muslim women. And I thought of no one more skilled and more able to walk us through some of that than introducing all of you to Raquel Saraswati. She is an American Muslim activist, writer, whose primary focus is on the rights of women and girls in the Muslim world and Islamization, and Islam in the West. Raquel is a vocal advocate for religious reform, for freedom and speech, and separation of mosque and state. She has worked to eradicate female genital mutilation, forced marriages, protection of women from abuse, and actually also is one of the stars in a documentary called Honor Diaries that I'd ask all of you to look at. She also worked closely with us at the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Raquel, welcome to the Seth Leibsohn Show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Raquel, let's jump right into it. Tell us, everybody sort of wonders, how do these young girls get all of a sudden one month they're nursing students in Colorado or normal, are perceived to be normal kids in college or in their young 20s, and next thing you know, they're getting on a plane and wanting to go serve the jihad in Syria and Iraq. So how does that happen to a young girl?
It really depends on the population or the group that the young woman is coming from. So if you're looking at young Muslim women, for example, a lot of what is not happening is while we look at the messaging of ISIS to the broader world, we're not really looking at what kind of messaging is going out to young Muslims, both men and women. And I've said repeatedly, and it just continues to prove true, that young Muslim women in particular are being pursued with messages of something like salvation and identity, that they can go to ISIS, they can go to serve the Mujahideen or become somebody's wife, and through that have a quote-unquote authentic Muslim identity, and that they can serve the Muslim community through motherhood, through purification of the self. There's a huge focus on portraying the Western world as somehow indulgent, somehow harmful to women, and that by becoming loyal to or going to join a group like ISIS, they are embracing a more pure and holy and authentic Muslim womanhood. The same kind of messaging, but spoken a bit differently, goes to non-Muslim young women. So the idea that they can be part of something, the idea that they can be in a female role that is empowered. It's a different kind of language, but that is empowered to fight oppression, that is empowered to fight, whatever the messaging is, the victim mantra that is being communicated at that moment, that they can be part of that cause. So it's really about identity. It's about gender and expressions of womanhood, and it's about ultimately establishing and preserving their interpretation of what a real Muslim state would be.
And so what happens when they get there? So they become part of this movement, and do they get there and say, oh my gosh, this wasn't what the manual said. It looked like the travel manual looked a little different from when they get there, and all of a sudden they realize they're becoming slaves and oppressed and see horrors? Or do they then buy into it hook, line, and sinker, and they accept the militancy that they become a part of? Is there some type of epiphany that happens, and many of them have expressed regret, or do they still fall into this mindset?
Again, it depends. ISIS, and particularly the women who are doing the recruiting of other women, they are preying on women and girls who have a weak sense of identity. They're preying on individuals who feel like they need to be part of something, and they're preying on young women who might have a particular interest in finding a mate, a male mate. That will complete them and give them some sense of identity. So depending on how extensive the brainwashing, and depending how successful it is, and on how malleable the mind is that they're working with, the young woman might become, in fact, very dedicated to the quote-unquote cause. Others have, of course, tried to return to their homeland, be it France or the UK or the United States, and that's much of the law there is for women is laid out by other women and enforced by other women, as well as men. But it's not the kind of thing, of course, you can easily return from.
And what do you think about DHS putting out this big warning today? I mean, does that help? Do you really think all American Muslim families watching CNN and Fox and all the media really says, oh, okay, now we're going to look? Do they know what to look for? Is this effective? Or if you were talking to the Secretary of Homeland Security, what would you be telling him they should be saying, or what should we be doing?
I would be saying that, yes, the entire Muslim community needs to band together in looking to protect our youth from this and to identify problems within, but that, generally speaking, the broad brushstrokes aren't as effective. We really do need to get better at looking at making sure our youth have a strong sense of identity, American identity, Western identity, whatever it is, and finding a way to make sure that that's in synergy with and not in conflict with their particular interpretation of Islam and their religion. So when you have a situation where youth are not sort of inoculated against the ideas of groups like these, if they don't have a sense of self, if they don't have a sense of community, that's when they become vulnerable. And so I would say to look for individuals who look to individuals who have those kinds of insecurities or lack of sense of self, and those might be individuals who are especially vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think, before you came on last hour, I was talking about movements that are successful. In Eric Hoffer's book, True Believer, he talks about the only movements that are mass movements that are successful are movements that people want to die for something. And he talks
Correct.
about religious movements, nationalistic movements, and he calls them Mohammedan, but obviously he's talking about Muslim movements. So I think here, what is it that we can do to counter these young vulnerable girls are looking for redemption and they want to die for the Islamic State? What can we do as American Muslims? And I know you've dedicated your life to this, and we work at AIFD, and you do it on so many other fronts. What can we do to make them want to die for something else like freedom?
Well, I think it begins, there are so many answers to that, right? I think there's a lot to be said for organizing both women and men, young women and men, in community with non-Muslim allies as well, to help youth have, just like happens with the Muslim Liberty Project, right? I mean, that's one small example of things that can happen across the country and around the world, of gathering youth who have a Muslim identity and helping them to identify ways that their Muslim identity can work with their national identity, with other things that are in their community, that they don't feel so alone, you know. And when it comes to women, young women in particular, we do continue to have a problem in our community with basic gender relations. And if people in our community are not talking about the ways that women are excluded from certain religious spaces or the very specific roles that are prescribed to them, then guess what? They're going to look elsewhere for a place in their community. And they might fall prey to people who say, hey, you know, here's an authentic Islam where you can serve the community through your role as a woman. If we're not doing that within our own communities, we make our communities vulnerable. So there's a lot to be said for making sure that women and men, how women and men are raised to interact with one another, needs to be healthy, needs to be something that drives them toward equality and toward full integration in the community.
Yeah, and I think, you know, our Muslim Liberty Project that you mentioned is so important because it actually teaches our youth that the American identity provides a laboratory, an atmosphere, a space to allow them to be empowered to define their Muslim nature, their Islamic identity in any way they want so that they can be individuals. So that empowerment makes it something that they want to die for, which is to be themselves while also being Muslim, which I think is why this American aspect to the reform against Islamism is so key. You've dedicated yourself to empowering women. Tell me about and tell us about the barriers of sort of this, Ezra Nomani calls it the honor brigade. You know, we often focus on honor killings, but yet in Phoenix here we've seen the death of Noor al-Maliki, but there's also been cases of honor abuse. A young girl a couple years later here in Phoenix, her parents later did get convicted for abuse, even though she was an adult. She was being tied down, prevented from going and dating and other things, so she wasn't killed but yet was abused. And later that girl tried to testify on behalf of her parents, saying that they didn't mean bad. Can you tell us, and we've only got a minute left, we'll come back in the next segment to finish, start the conversation about sort of how honor plays into this.
Well, honor, the concept of honor, it does transcend some community lines, so it certainly doesn't affect just Muslims, but, you know, I work from a Muslim perspective, so of course that's where I focus most heavily. In honor culture, the woman's body is, and what the woman does, is the barometer of piety, politics, and purity of the family and the larger community. So anything that she does is seen as reflective on that community. And there are people who are more than ready to punish her in various ways, up to death, in order to preserve that so-called honor.
And when we come back, we'll continue to talk about honor abuse, honor killings, her documentary that she participated in, Honor Diaries. Follow me on Twitter, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, DRZUHDI Jasser. Follow Raquel Avita, one of our heroes, and I think an American leader in women's rights. Raquel, R-A-Q-U-E-L, Avita, E-V-I-T-A on Twitter. This is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser filling in for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Raquel Saraswati, American Muslim activist and women's leader, a role model for many of us. When we come back, thanks.
Waiting out a blizzard, Arizona, dancing across the desert, watching the sun setting on.
This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show, and I am privileged to be joined by a colleague, a friend, and one of the leaders in the front lines for Muslim reform against Islamism, Raquel Saraswati, a American Muslim activist and writer whose primary focus has always been the rights of women and girls in the Muslim world and Islamic communities in the West. Look up her stuff. She has a number of speeches, a prolific writer and leader, and follow her on Twitter at Raquel Avita, R-A-Q-U-E-L, Avita, E-V-I-T-A. Raquel, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me again.
So we talked about honor. You were sort of beginning to lay out for the audience what honor is. How does that play into? And again, it's not always religious. It crosses religious lines, as you said. But there is obviously the interplay of Islamic theology and Sharia law, and we see that the Sharia is often used, not the Sharia we know in our personal faiths, but it's often used as a tool to oppress women. And how does that play into the honor for the community?
Well, where we often hear of it, when young women say that they believe that their families might hurt them or worse, kill them because of, quote, religion, I think a lot of people say, well, that's absurd. There's nothing Islamic about killing your child, and I would agree with that, and you would agree with that. Every Muslim that we know would agree with that. Unfortunately, when some of these individuals are later arrested or their jail tapes released related to a case, these men are often saying, I did it for my honor, I did it for Allah, I did it, because my religion told me to do that. And so that, as I've always said, raises a really uncomfortable question, right? So you and I don't believe that there's any Islamic justification for an honor-based killing, but unfortunately there are men who do believe that. We have to really unpack where they're getting that idea from and what we're doing to combat it, and what our imams, what our community leaders are doing to combat that, more than just saying, this is forbidden, and this has nothing to do with Islam. We need more than that. We need them to be actually encountering the misogyny in their communities and in our communities that helps these men feel empowered to carry out these abuses against women.
And I think one of the things I want to lift up quickly is, Jordan, rightfully so, the King of Jordan was lauded, and his approval ratings went through the roof, I think, as he wore his jumpsuit and was going to go do the eye for the eye thing and kill ISIS and their families and other things, as he said he was going to do. But yet the laws in Jordan, what do his laws in his country say should happen to brothers and uncles or fathers or husbands who kill their wives or kill their daughters, who dishonor their family? Can you tell us a little about what that law says?
Well, some of I don't have the entire legal text in front of me, but some of the Jordanian family law, you can get off with a small fine or no jail time or limited jail time, depending on the nature of the crime. And these honor-based offenses carry less jail time, and you can get off much more easily than if, let's say, a woman were to kill the man who had sexually assaulted her. If a woman has somehow dishonored the family, the penalty for killing her is significantly less. And so a lot of people, and I understand, a lot of people look to these leaders in the Middle East taking on ISIS or supposedly taking on ISIS, right? And they get very excited about that. But they're not looking at the bigger picture. They're not looking at what these so-called moderate leaders are doing to women and what they're doing to religious and sexual minorities in their countries. So
when we hear our Homeland Security Secretary today talking about telling American families to be careful, your youth may be taken, and go over there because they get pulled in, as you and I were just talking about last segment. In Jordan, it's 100 to thousands of times magnitude Jordanians that went to fight with ISIS. So the king has a bigger problem, and it's not just because of ISIS's propaganda, but he has a little boot camp because of these laws that are, he would rather run the Islamic State of his kingdom, but the laws are not much different. Now, obviously, they're more quote-unquote benevolent or whatever you want to call it, but it's still misogynistic. How about in America? If we want to do this reform work, Raquel, what are some of the obstacles from the organized Islamic community that claims to represent Muslims that don't let us have this conversation? I mean, God bless Seth for giving us the opportunity to get our voice out, but what are the obstacles that we face here in free America?
Oh, Zudi, I think we only have a 9-minute segment. We could go on for a long time. So I would say it's, there are many. Just one example is that there are events that happen around the country that host, sort of the grade A imams that purportedly speak for us, that end up at the White House dinners. And, these are the same men who preside over mosques where the conditions are abysmal for women. These are the same men who preside over services where, they're not taking on the misogyny within their own communities. They're not addressing issues of domestic violence, marital rape, freedom to marry, for young women to marry the people of their choosing or none. And so we have some real internal critique to do and real internal reform to do. And we can do that and remain authentic Muslims. There's nothing stopping us from doing that. But there is real pushback when ordinary Muslims choose to engage those conversations, no matter who you are. I always say that on these issues, you may cross that fine line before you even know it, and find yourself really at the receiving end of an awful lot of reprisal from the community.
And even, newspapers like the LA Times were pushing out this great thing, which was an all-women's mosque, and I can see how important that was. And yes, many of those women that did that needed a lot of courage to do that, but yet sometimes I wonder if that almost marginalizes women more, in that there's a big problem that there aren't enough women on boards of mosques around the country. Women may want to be able to divorce their husbands, and the imam tells them, well, go back and solve your problems and don't go to the American court system, etc. So what do you think about the ability of us to engage our own communities publicly on the reforms necessary?
Well, I think the Muslim Women's Mosque, actually, I think rather than marginalizing further, I think what it did was say very publicly, hey, we have such a problem in, this, quote unquote, freest nation on earth, that we actually have to go and create our own mosque space.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Exactly. And it did that in a very public way. And I think, and that's great, and there was pushback on that. A young American Muslim woman just wrote an article about, practicing Islam. It was called Practicing Islam in Short Shorts. And the amount of ink, and what she meant by that was sort of not being sort of a covered head to toe woman, or she was not dressing like myself even, and, having sort of this modern relationship with God. That is authentically Islamic, but that is, engaging a young American lifestyle, and the amount of ink and time spent by young Muslim men in sort of berating her and publicly shaming her in the United States was incredibly telling. And so I think we really do have an uphill battle here, but beginning to organize in our own communities and demanding that, these, I don't want to say type A, but sort of these self-appointed ambassadors of our community really do get called out as much as they try to call us out. That's the real thing. They try to silence people like us through shame, intimidation, bullying, to deflect from what's going on in their own communities.
Amen. And, I think as long as Americans understand, we're not trying to displace their voices and say they don't have a right, but let America witness the debate. Let them understand there are women leaders like Raquel Saraswati out there. And when we started the program, Raquel, I talked about a threat that Tariq and I had that was a blogger at ummah.com that said we are the hijab is cultural crowd, which is absurd. But thank you for everything you do. Keep shaking the trees about honor violence, honor abuse, and educating Americans that there are Muslims that believe in American values. God bless you, Raquel Saraswati.
You too.
Thank you so much. You're welcome. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show. We'll be right back.
What a beautiful noise coming up from the street.
This is Zuhdi Jasser filling in for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show. Bill, I have to tell you, Neil Diamond, they're coming to America is one of the, to think of an Arab Muslim family from Syria who would sing a song that really, I think, has a lot of Jewish ancestry as far as sort of the Ellis Island story, and they're coming to America, but yet it was one of my favorite songs that my family believed in because America gave us freedom that no other country could, that Syria couldn't in the 60s when my family escaped. And now we see what's happening, that finally there's life in Syria. The prison of Syria has awoken, has been unleashed, unfortunately, as with all dictatorships that sit for generations. They do not leave in a clean way. And thank you for reminding me about Neil Diamond there. Now, it's always, I think it's just amazing to listen to the courageous young women who are going to, if there's anyone that's going to save our religion from the Islamists and the theocrats, I believe it's the feminist leaders, those who believe in American freedom and liberty, who believe in our faith. and the fact that we don't answer to anyone except to God, and that ultimately, there was a man who won a Nobel Prize of economics back in 2004, I believe. His name was Muhammad Yunus. And Mr. Yunus won a prize because he developed what now is a well-known microloan program. And you take a few $1,000s, $10,000, $15,000, and you give it to women in Bangladesh or Pakistan or in areas of the world where that money can do quite a bit. They start up their own business. They then become unshackled from their husbands, their brothers, their fathers, their uncles. And that independence, repeatedly, story after story, allowed them to be able to turn back and tell their misogynistic family at times that their interpretations of the Quran are wrong, that ultimately they, as women, have an equal right to decisions, to professions, to educations, to economic independence, and that economic independence was the key to what allowed them to do that. And again, you have, I believe, if you want to look at the solution of the OIC's mafia of dictatorship and theocracy, or oligarchical Islamism, if you will, I believe that the women's movements will lead that. We saw that in the Egyptian Arab awakening. We saw that in Tunisia. It was there in Syria initially, and now, unfortunately, has been snuffed out by a military that is killing anything that goes into the streets to protest, and the West sits silent. I remember going to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and I was actually also to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and you look at the media section that shows the newspapers, the front pages that were talking openly with pictures of what was happening to the Jews in the Holocaust under the Nazis. For month after month, day after day in newspapers, it was being reported, and yet years went by before the free world did anything about it. And in Syria, we have reporters who are disappearing, heroes like Kayla Mueller who go to provide humanitarian aid who disappear and end up dying at the hands of ISIS and at the Assad regime. We forget the journalists that went in initially in 2011 to report to the world what was happening. And yet, they vanish and the stories decrease. They don't increase. The coverage of Syria, Anderson Cooper was covering it every day on CNN. And we may have our differences on politics with Anderson and others on CNN, but the bottom line is they were covering the Syrian conflict more than any other media initially. And now it decreased quite a bit. It seems as if the Syrian propaganda machine, the Syrian electronic army, in cahoots with the Russian media machine, and Iran seems to have controlled the story. I have to tell you, last year to see our media rush to interview the thug-in-chief, the leader of the killing machine of the Syrian army, Bashar Assad, was interviewed by almost every network from Charlie Rose to CBS to Fox and on. And he went and would post the entire video. Actually, before the networks would post it, he would post the entire video because his news agency was also allowed to tape those same interviews, which tells you about the propaganda value to what he was doing. And it was unfortunate that our media participated in that. To read today about Kerry's trip to Saudi Arabia, in which he's talking about Iran and Yemen's instability. The AP story said that U.S. officials said Kerry would stress that the United States does not see a military solution to the conflict in Syria. Does not see a military solution. And then it says, but he doesn't think there's a political solution as possible either as long as Bashar Assad remains in power. So wait a minute. So if the Syrian military was as smart as the Egyptian one and it had changed its military head and taken its president down and put somebody else in, that would change anything? This is a military fascist regime that's entire machine believes that they are Syria, they will do anything to stay in power, and they are allied with Iran, who's feeding them money and bullets and rockets and jets and whatever they need, including human assets and their Republican Guard. So they will exterminate the Sunni moderates, and they will engage the radicals as they need to. There is no political solution. The only solution for Syria is that their one side will lose militarily. That's what I said to Congress in 2011, and what I still believe. Most wars for good versus evil, evil only went away when they were defeated militarily. America doesn't need boots on the ground. We can do this with no-fly zones. Right now, over 90% of those being killed are being killed by barrel bombs from the Assad regime. That can be stopped with a no-fly zone. Now, yes, that might leave a bigger mess, but nothing is more messy than what Assad is doing. And the light at the end of the tunnel, that tunnel may be 5 years away, 20 years away. Iran spent 30 years over now an Islamist regime. But I can tell you, if Iran ever has a free election again, the Islamists will never be reelected. And the way to freedom had to be out of the Shah's existence. It could not have been with the continuation of a monarchy in Iran and a dictatorship. And that's the way the Arab awakening was moving. And I think, unfortunately, as Kerry goes and does his genuflection tour 6.0 through the Middle East, it's unfortunate that he's not using that type of terminology. When we come back, we'll continue talking about Islamic reform, American strategy, and the threats as we see them. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn on The Seth Leibsohn Show. This is Zuhdi Jasser sitting in for Seth Leibsohn on The Seth Leibsohn Show. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser been in the house this week, and it's been fun. Though I think it'll be great to have Seth back and back in his own chair. I'll be going to Ottawa this weekend to speak at the Manning Networking Conference. The Toronto Sun says that our session will be a must-watch session on countering Islamic terrorism at the Manning's Networking Center conference of 2015, sort of the CPAC of Canada, if you will, this Saturday. We were talking about, actually at the beginning, one of the things I'm going to wear as a badge of honor is one of these largest Islamist sites out of Britain, which is globally one of the main centers of conversation at ummah.com, says that myself and Tariq Fatah and the Killiam Foundation in London are 100,000 times more dangerous to this ummah or the Muslim community globally than any kuffar. 100. So, ladies and gentlemen, your sub-in for Seth is 100,000 times more dangerous than any of the kuffar. So that means we're having effect. We're having an impact. When your enemies, when the Islamists who want to dominate the world with Islamic states, or the ummah.com as they call themselves, with millions of viewers that spread the radicalization of our youth against the West, calls us 100,000 more times a threat, then we're being effective and we must be right. And again, as we talked about earlier, the truth, to say the truth to power is, I think, what is important and what changes mankind. We talked about Eric Hoffer and the true believer. It's, I think, important. He says it's necessary for most of us these days to have some insight into the motives and responses of the true believer. So not only the true believer for good, but also you, me, we should all understand how these ISIS folks get created and what makes them a true believer, what makes the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia a true believer, what makes the Islamist Khomeinists of Iran who publish this nonsense that somehow they're, on the one hand, they call themselves a haven for Jews, and yet on the other hand deny the Holocaust. So these are haters, these are anti-Semites, these are fascists in the name of Islam, and yet very few people in America know how they think. When we finally got into World War II, how many Americans had actually read Mein Kampf? So today's Mein Kampf is the Iranian website. It is the Twitter feed of Khamenei, who daily tweets about wanting to raise the flag of Iran over the White House. So these are not individuals that are in any way hiding what their real goals are. They say what they are, and yet we're supposed to somehow feel safe that a deal with them is going to be honest and keep us from allowing them to get nuclear weapons. No. I think, as Michael Rubin told us a few days ago, they need to be afraid of us so that they are forced to come to the table, not because they want to come to the table, but because they have to. That sanctions ultimately will destroy their economy, and that is what the reason why they will not develop nuclear weapons, not because they have any sense of belief that it is the right thing to do. These people don't do what's right. They want to create a new caliphate, be it Shia or Sunni. Eric Hoffer goes on, for though ours is a godless age, it is the very opposite of irreligious. The true believer is everywhere on the march, and both by converting and antagonizing, he is shaping the world in his own image. And whether we are to line up with him or against him, it is well that we should know all we can concerning his nature and potentialities. So some want to paint this as a holy war. Yes, there is a holy war, I believe, within Islam, as my book is, The Battle for the Soul of Islam. But what do we want to convert people to? I believe we want to convert them into liberals, classical liberals who believe in liberty. That is our true belief. I believe, my true belief as a conservative is that I believe the advancement of America's experiment and recipe for success is that religious freedom is our first freedom, and all other freedoms, speech and otherwise, follow thereof. And that is the antidote. A First Amendment based in the Establishment Clause is the antidote to political Islam. Every Islamic state of the 56 majority countries is guided on that premise, that they believe that the Islamic state rights come from Islamic state, not from God, but from the Islamic state, and thus they have to have Sharia in place to tell their citizens what their rights are, because rights come from Islam and their interpretation, not from God directly, which is what our founding fathers did to reform against theocracy and provide, as Christians, a country that became the best place to live, the freest place to live on the planet. And I think ultimately, until we believe in this type of exceptionalism, and I'm not ashamed of that exceptionalism, nobody should be. We should be able to advance that. And it's not just simply American, but it's human. It's based from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, as your friendly local doc, who is 100,000 times more dangerous to the Islamic movement, the Islamist movement globally, than any non-Muslim, as they call them, and you can see these things posted. We engage these folks on their Facebook pages, on their Twitter feeds, and you'll find them constantly coming after us. Why? Because we are a threat. The threat to their movement is not terrorism. It's not jets and bombs. Yes, we have to defeat the ISIS's and Al-Qaeda's and Jabhat al-Nusra's of the world with missiles and with military might so that we decimate them. But the pools they swim in, the much bigger iceberg underneath that tip of militancy, is Islamism. And the way to defeat that is with ideas, with the truth. And yesterday at the panel at ASU, somebody asked me what we can do as non-Muslims. Well, get the truth out. Spread it over social media. Get the pictures that's happening in Syria out to the world to see what both the Assad jihadists with Iran are doing and the ISIS jihadists are doing to destroy the normal moderates in the middle. Get the truth out about the prisoners of conscience in Saudi Arabia, that the king of Saudi Arabia is not our friend. He's not even a frenemy. Yes, we want him on our side against Iran and against Al-Qaeda, but at the end of the day, he is not a solution. He is still, and their government, the Wahhabis, are still an enemy. So when we come back, it'll be the last segment that I'll be covering for Seth this week, and we'll leave you with some parting thoughts in this very busy week. And hopefully, I've enjoyed being with you, and I've learned quite a bit talking to our guests this week, and I appreciate the opportunity to share some time with you. My Twitter feed is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, DrZuhdiJasser. My Facebook page is MZ Jasser. Please look up my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. There are American Muslims that want to die for liberty and want to defeat those who want to die for the Islamic State. We'll be right back. This is Zuhdi Jasser filling in for Seth Leibsohn on The Seth Leibsohn Show.
Phone rings, baby cries, TV diet, guru lies. Good morning, honey. Go to work.
This is Zuhdi Jasser in our last segment together this week, filling in for Seth Leibsohn as he took some time off and is, I'm sure, anxious to get back in his chair, which he relinquished to me for a few days. And thank you for giving me the opportunity, Seth, to get to know your audience and have them get to know me. It's been a privilege and an honor to sit in your chair. I'll be going to the Manny Networking Conference in Canada, their CPAC. Actually, if any of you want to see my speech to CPAC on the main stage, we posted it at our YouTube website at AIFD TV. I'm the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. And follow our work. I think that part of the reason Seth gave me this chance was it's important. It's not just about me, but I think Americans should get to know American Muslims who get it, who understand the gravity of what we're fighting, and yet can thread that needle between understanding the threat, but yet realizing that American Muslims have an opportunity to set the stage globally for how to repair, how to defeat the ideas that fuel radical Islam. And ultimately, I hope in these 4 days, sharing the news of the day and talking to all of you, we have been able to do that. I think earlier you also realized that this isn't just about Muslim reformers that are male, but also female. This is I think women leaders like Raquel and others who are part of it. Look at the ad that we ran on January 11th in the New York Times. It's on my homepage at aifdemocracy.org. Leaders like Raheel Raza, Zainab Zeb, and Zainab El-Suwaid at the American Islamic Congress and others are working for Islamic reform against political Islam. And there's no time greater than the present than to start to help us develop platforms to do that. I think, there's a book that meant a lot to me called Out of Revolution, Autobiography of Western Man by Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy. And there's a quote there that I cite frequently. He said, "To a mankind that recognizes the equality of man everywhere, every war becomes a civil war." If you believe in the virtues of America and the fact that we are the leaders of doing good in the world, then we have a role to play in civil wars. And Syria, by the way, is not a civil war. It is a regional conflict in which Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and others, and Russia have stuck their hands in and annexed it and made it into client states. While the free world sits out, evil will reign. If the free world tries to have a strategy which should be a liberty doctrine against the Darwin doctrine that exists, then we will win. Understand what their true belief is to be able to defeat them. We have our own true beliefs. This is Zuhdi Jasser. It's been an honor to sit in for Seth. Seth, hurry back. Your audience needs you. Get back to teaching Arizona and teaching the world what are the priorities we should have as Americans. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, it's been a privilege to get to know you, and we'll talk to you on the other side. Sitting in for Seth Leibsohn on the Seth Leibsohn Show. God bless.